What if I told you that the greatest psychological manipulation in human history wasn't orchestrated by a politician, a general, or even a king, but by a carpenter from a backwater town called Nazareth? In just 3 decades, this man didn't just challenge the Roman Empire. He rewrote the entire playbook of power itself. While emperors conquered through fear and force, he conquered through something far more dangerous: the human mind. Today, I'm going to reveal the 3 psychological strategies that turned a Jewish carpenter into the most influential figure who ever lived. Strategies so powerful that they're still reshaping civilizations 2,000 years later. And here's what will shock you most. These weren't accidents. They were calculated moves that demonstrate a psychological sophistication that would make modern strategists weep. If you're building anything that matters, the most powerful psychological weapons in human history have been hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. What I'm about to reveal will change everything you know about influence. Here's what most people completely misunderstand about the carpenter from Nazareth. They think his power came from miracles, from divine intervention, from something supernatural that we can't analyze or replicate. That's not just wrong, it's dangerously naive. Because while everyone's been looking up at the sky for explanations, they've missed the most sophisticated psychological operation ever conducted on planet Earth. Consider this. The Roman Empire was the most powerful civilization in human history. They had legions that could crush entire nations, infrastructure that connected 3 continents, and a political system so advanced that modern governments still copy their blueprints. Yet within 300 years of this carpenter's death, the empire that crucified him was kneeling before his symbol. That's not luck. That's not divine magic. That's psychological warfare at its most brutal and effective. But here's where it gets fascinating. Conventional history tells us this happened through love and peace and turning the other cheek. Wrong. That's the surface story, the marketing campaign. The real story is about power, raw, calculated, strategic power that makes Machiavelli look like an amateur. This carpenter understood something about human psychology that took modern science 2,000 years to rediscover. People don't follow strength. They follow perceived authenticity combined with emotional manipulation. The Roman emperors made a critical error. They projected power through dominance, through spectacle, through fear. They said, "We are gods, worship us or die." But the carpenter, he did something infinitely more dangerous. He projected power through vulnerability. He said, "I am like you, but I know secrets you don't." And that, my friends, is when the Roman Empire began its psychological surrender. Even though they didn't realize it yet, most people see humility and think weakness. But strategic humility, that's the ultimate Trojan horse of influence. And this carpenter had turned it into a weapon of mass psychological destruction. Here's the first psychological strategy that changed everything: the power of strategic vulnerability. While every other leader in history projected invincibility, this carpenter did the exact opposite. He deliberately displayed weakness, failure, and emotional pain. And it wasn't accident, it was calculated psychological genius. Think about the Roman model of leadership. Caesar stands above the crowd, draped in purple, surrounded by guards, untouchable. The message is clear: I am not like you. I am better than you. I am unreachable. It's pure intimidation psychology. And for centuries it worked, but it also created a fatal weakness: emotional distance. People feared Caesar, but they couldn't identify with him. Now watch what the carpenter does. He's born in a stable, not a palace, not even a house, a barn where animals sleep. He grows up in Nazareth, a town so insignificant that other Jews mocked it. He works with his hands. He gets hungry, tired, frustrated. He cries publicly when his friend dies. He sweats blood when he's afraid. He even admits he doesn't know certain things. Every single detail is strategically designed to trigger identification psychology. But here's the genius part. While projecting this vulnerability, he simultaneously claims ultimate authority. I and the Father are one. That's not humility, that's strategic positioning. He's saying, I am exactly like you in every way that matters emotionally, but I have access to ultimate power. It's the perfect psychological combination. Relatability plus authority equals unstoppable influence. The Romans never saw it coming, because they couldn't understand the strategy. To them, power was about elevation and separation. But this carpenter understood something deeper about human psychology. People will follow someone they perceive as one of them who has figured out the cheat codes to existence. He made divinity accessible while keeping it exclusive. He became the ultimate insider who offered membership to anyone willing to surrender their will to his vision. This is why his followers didn't just admire him, they died for him. Caesar's followers served him for money, status, or fear, but when you make people feel like you understand their pain while possessing the solution to their deepest problems, you don't get servants, you get fanatics. And fanatics, as history proves, are infinitely more powerful than armies. Let me break this down with an analogy that will make this crystal clear. Imagine you're at a networking event filled with executives in expensive suits, all trying to one-up each other with stories about their success, their connections, their achievements. Everyone's performing invincibility. Then someone walks in wearing jeans and a t-shirt. He sits down at your table and says, "Man, I've been struggling with this project. I actually failed twice before figuring it out." Instantly, your guard drops. Finally, someone real, someone honest, someone you can relate to. But then he continues, "But here's what I discovered in those failures," and proceeds to share insights that completely blow your mind. Suddenly, this casually dressed failure is the most magnetic person in the room. Why? Because he combined vulnerability with value, relatability with revelation. That's exactly what the carpenter did, except he was playing for the highest stakes possible, the future of human civilization. He made himself relatable to peasants, slaves, outcasts, all the people the Roman system ignored or oppressed. But instead of just commiserating with their problems, he offered them a solution that was both practical and transcendent. Love your enemies isn't just spiritual advice, it's psychological warfare. When you love someone who expects hatred, you completely disarm them. You become unpredictable, mysterious, powerful. The Romans built their empire on predictable responses. Intimidate, people submit. Threaten, people comply. Display power, people obey. But love in response to hatred, forgiveness in response to violence, that broke their entire psychological framework. They literally didn't know how to respond to someone who absorbed their attacks and transformed them into something else entirely. This is why the carpenter's strategy was so devastatingly effective. He didn't fight the Roman system, he made it irrelevant. He created a parallel power structure based on voluntary devotion rather than coerced compliance. And voluntary devotion, once you trigger it, is infinitely more sustainable than forced obedience. If this is exploding your mind, stop now and hit the subscribe button. Why? Because what comes next will explode your understanding of psychological influence, and if you don't subscribe, the algorithm will hide my next secrets from you. But strategic vulnerability was just the beginning. The carpenter's second psychological strategy was even more sophisticated, and it's something that modern marketers spend billions trying to replicate. He transformed abstract concepts into unforgettable stories that hijacked people's emotional operating systems. Here's what most people don't realize about the Roman Empire's greatest weakness. Despite all their military might and political sophistication, they were terrible at storytelling. Roman culture was built on facts, laws, structures, hierarchies. Everything was literal, documented, bureaucratic. Even their gods were basically immortal humans with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. There was no mystery, no emotional journey, no personal transformation available to the average person. The Roman citizen's life was predetermined. You were born into a class, you performed your function, you died in that class. The end. Even their entertainment, the gladiator games, were just spectacle, brutal, immediate, but ultimately forgettable. You watched someone else's drama, felt a momentary thrill, then went home to your predetermined existence. There was no narrative thread connecting your personal struggles to any larger meaning or purpose. But the carpenter, he understood something about human psychology that wouldn't be formally recognized until modern neuroscience. The human brain is literally wired for story. We don't just think in narratives, we are narratives. Our entire sense of identity, purpose, and meaning is constructed through the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. So while the Romans were saying, obey these laws, perform these functions, accept your fate, the carpenter was saying, you are the protagonist of the greatest story ever told. He took fishermen and tax collectors and prostitutes, people the Roman system had written off as expendable, and cast them as heroes in a cosmic drama where their choices would determine the fate of eternity itself. This wasn't just inspiration, this was psychological alchemy. He was literally reprogramming people's sense of identity and significance. Every parable, every interaction, every teaching was designed to help ordinary people see themselves as central characters in a story that mattered more than any emperor's conquest. And here's the crucial detail. He made these stories interactive. The Roman myths were spectator events. You heard about what gods and heroes did, but the carpenter's stories required participation, decision. Here's the genius of the carpenter's narrative strategy. He didn't just tell better stories than the Romans, he created a story framework that was psychologically irresistible because it fulfilled humanity's deepest narrative needs while offering an escape from the Roman narrative prison. Every human being craves three things in their personal story: significance, transformation, and hope. The Roman system offered none of these. You were significant only if you were born into nobility. Transformation was impossible. Social mobility was virtually non-existent. And hope? Hope was for idiots who didn't understand how power really worked. But watch what the carpenter does. He crafts parables where the last become first, where servants become masters, where the rejected stone becomes the cornerstone of the entire structure. These aren't just nice stories. They're psychological weapons designed to detonate inside people's consciousness and completely reconstruct their understanding of reality. Take the prodigal son parable. On the surface, it's about forgiveness and family reconciliation. But psychologically, it's about reframing failure as the beginning of transformation rather than the end of possibility. The son who squanders everything becomes more beloved than the son who never failed. That's not just radical theology, that's revolutionary psychology that directly contradicts the Roman merit-based system. Or consider the Good Samaritan story. The hero isn't a priest, a leader, or even a fellow Jew. It's an outsider, someone from a despised group. The psychological message is devastating. Worth isn't determined by social position, religious authority, or tribal membership. It's determined by actions that align with deeper principles. This completely undermines the Roman hierarchy that claimed authority based on birth, position, and power. But here's the most sophisticated element. The carpenter made himself the ultimate character in every story, while making everyone else potential protagonists. He positioned himself as the king, the bridegroom, the shepherd, the way, the truth, the life, but always in relationship to others who had agency and choice. People weren't passive subjects in his kingdom. They were active participants whose decisions shaped the outcome. This created something the Romans couldn't compete with: voluntary, emotional investment. When you make someone the hero of their own transformation story, they don't just follow you. They become part of you. Your success becomes their success. Your vision becomes their vision. Your story becomes their story. The Romans ruled through external compliance. But the carpenter, he achieved something far more dangerous: internal alignment. He convinced people to want what he wanted them to want. And once you've achieved that level of psychological integration, force becomes unnecessary. People police themselves, motivate themselves, and recruit others themselves because they're not serving your agenda. They're fulfilling their own story. Here's an analogy that will make this strategy crystal clear. Imagine you're playing a video game where you're stuck as a low-level character with no special abilities, no way to advance, and no hope of ever becoming significant. That was life in the Roman Empire for 99% of people. You were an NPC, a non-player character in someone else's game. Now imagine someone shows up and says, actually, you're not an NPC. You're the main character in a game so important that cosmic forces are watching your every move. Every choice you make affects the ultimate outcome. You can level up, gain new abilities, and eventually become more powerful than those who seem to control you now. But first, you need to understand the real rules of the game. That's exactly what the carpenter did, except instead of a video game, he was reprogramming people's understanding of reality itself. He took slaves, peasants, outcasts, people who had been told their entire lives that they were insignificant background characters, and convinced them they were the protagonists of the most important story ever told. But here's the genius part. He made the game winnable through actions anyone could take. You don't win by being born into the right family, accumulating wealth, or gaining political power. You win by loving, serving, forgiving, sacrificing. These are skills anyone can develop, regardless of their starting position. The Romans created a game where only a few people could win, and everyone else existed to serve the winners. But the carpenter created a game where everyone could potentially win, but only by playing according to his rules. It's psychological genius. You maintain control while making people feel empowered. Think about why people today still quote his stories 2,000 years later, while no one remembers the speeches of Roman emperors who ruled vast territories. Stories that make you the hero of your own transformation are infinitely more memorable and motivating than commands that make you a subject in someone else's empire. The carpenter understood that humans don't just want to be led, they want to matter. And when you give people a story where they can be both significant and transformed, you don't get subjects. You get evangelists, people who will spread your message not because you commanded them to, but because they genuinely believe it's the best news they've ever heard. If you're watching this far, you are different from most people. Prove it. Hit that like button now and subscribe, because people like you deserve to know all the secrets I'll reveal in upcoming videos. But the carpenter's most devastating psychological strategy was also his most dangerous. He transformed ultimate defeat into ultimate victory, turning his own execution into the marketing campaign that would eventually conquer the very empire that killed him. This isn't just remarkable. It's psychologically impossible unless you understand the dark arts of narrative manipulation and symbolic warfare. Here's what makes this strategy so mind-blowing. Throughout human history, when leaders died violently, their movements typically died with them. Assassination was the Roman Empire's ultimate solution to troublesome figures. Kill the leader, scatter the followers, problem solved. It worked every single time, until the carpenter. The Romans had this whole thing figured out scientifically. Crucifixion wasn't just execution. It was psychological warfare designed to destroy not just the victim, but the very idea they represented. You died slowly, publicly, naked, and in agony. The message was clear. This is what happens to people who challenge Rome. This is how powerless you really are. Look at your hero now. Broken, defeated, abandoned even by his own god. It was the perfect power display because it targeted every psychological weakness humans have. Our fear of pain, our horror of public humiliation, our need to see our leaders as strong and victorious. Crucifixion was designed to make followers question everything they believed about their leader. If he was truly powerful, truly chosen, truly divine, how could he end up here, dying like a common criminal? And initially, it worked exactly as planned. The carpenter's followers scattered. They hid. They were traumatized, confused, and convinced they had backed the wrong horse. For 3 days, the Roman psychological operation was a complete success. The troublesome movement was effectively dead. But then something unprecedented happened in the history of power and propaganda. The apparent defeat was reframed as the ultimate victory. Somehow, the followers regrouped and began telling a story that was so psychologically sophisticated, so emotionally compelling, that it turned the crucifixion from proof of the carpenter's powerlessness into evidence of his ultimate power. How do you transform execution into exaltation? How do you turn public humiliation into private vindication? How do you convince people that losing is actually winning? This isn't just spin. This is psychological alchemy of the highest order. And once you understand the mechanics of how they pulled this off, you'll realize you've been witnessing the greatest comeback story in human history. The Romans thought they were writing the ending to the carpenter's story, but what they actually did was provide him with the most powerful symbol in human history: voluntary sacrifice for others. And that symbol would prove more destructive to their empire than any army ever fielded against them. Here's how the carpenter's followers pulled off the greatest psychological reversal in human history. They weaponized sacrifice. They took the Roman Empire's ultimate symbol of power, the ability to kill anyone who opposed them, and transformed it into evidence of love so profound that it redefined power itself. The genius was in the reframing. Instead of saying, "Our leader was defeated," they said, "Our leader chose this." Instead of, "He was powerless to save himself," they said, "He had the power to save himself but chose to save us instead." Instead of, "He failed," they said, "He succeeded at something more important than survival. He demonstrated love without limits." But here's the psychologically devastating part. They backed up this reframing with the most compelling narrative structure ever created. They didn't just claim he rose from the dead. They structured the entire story according to humanity's deepest psychological patterns about death and rebirth, suffering and redemption, sacrifice and reward. Every culture in human history has stories about heroes who die and return transformed. It's hardwired into our psychological architecture. But the Carpenter's followers took this universal pattern and personalized it. They didn't just tell people about a hero who died and rose again. They offered people the chance to participate in the same pattern themselves. You could die to your old life and be reborn into something better. The Carpenter's death wasn't just his story. It was a doorway into your story. This created a psychological phenomenon that the Romans couldn't combat with traditional methods: voluntary martyrdom. Suddenly, people were lining up to die for this movement. Not because they were defeated or desperate, but because they genuinely believed that dying for the Carpenter's cause was actually winning. They had been convinced that temporary physical defeat was permanent spiritual victory. The Romans were completely unprepared for this. Their entire system was built on the assumption that people avoid pain and seek pleasure, that survival is the highest value, that death is the ultimate defeat. But the Carpenter's followers had been psychologically reprogrammed to see death as graduation, persecution as proof of righteousness, and suffering as participation in cosmic victory. Even worse for Rome. Every time they killed a Christian, they were providing more evidence for the Christian narrative. See, our leader was right. The powers of this world will always persecute the powers of the next world. Your violence proves our point. The Romans were trapped in a psychological loop where their traditional solutions only strengthened their opposition. Within 300 years, the empire that crucified the Carpenter was flying his symbol on their banners and making his teachings the official state religion. Not because they were militarily defeated, but because they were psychologically outmaneuvered by a narrative so compelling that even emperors eventually surrendered to its logic. The Carpenter had achieved something no conqueror in history ever managed. He convinced his enemies to voluntarily adopt his worldview. And he did it through the ultimate power move, making his death mean more than their lives. Let me give you the perfect analogy for this psychological masterpiece. Imagine you're playing chess against a grandmaster. You think you're winning because you've captured their queen, the most powerful piece on the board. You're celebrating. You think the game is over, but then you realize the grandmaster sacrificed their queen deliberately. By losing their queen, they positioned the rest of their pieces for checkmate. What looked like your greatest victory was actually their setup for ultimate victory. You won the battle but lost the war, and you only realize it when it's too late to change the outcome. That's exactly what happened between the Carpenter and Rome. The Romans thought capturing and executing him was their victory. They had eliminated the threat, proved their power, and demonstrated the futility of opposing their empire. But the Carpenter's followers revealed that the execution wasn't defeat, it was strategy. By dying publicly and voluntarily, the Carpenter had accomplished something impossible for any living leader. He became the perfect victim and the perfect hero simultaneously. Perfect victims generate unlimited sympathy and moral authority. Perfect heroes inspire unlimited loyalty and sacrifice. Combine both in one person, and you create a psychological weapon that no empire can defend against. The Romans controlled bodies, but the Carpenter's story controlled minds. And minds, once changed, change everything else. Every person convinced by his narrative became a recruiter for more people. Every martyr created more converts. Every act of persecution proved the Christian point that this world's powers were temporary and corrupt, while their leader's power was eternal and pure. Here's what makes this strategy so psychologically sophisticated. It made resistance itself evidence of the message's truth. If the Romans ignored Christians, It proved Christianity was growing and couldn't be stopped. If they persecuted Christians, it proved Christians were right about the nature of worldly power. The Romans literally could not win, because any response they chose supported their opponent's narrative. The carpenter had solved the ultimate strategic problem. How do you defeat an empire when you have no army, no wealth, and no political connections? You convince people that the empire's greatest strength, its ability to kill its enemies, is actually proof of its weakness. You redefine victory so completely that losing becomes winning, and winning becomes irrelevant. This is why his symbol conquered Rome, while Rome's symbols are now historical curiosities. Psychological victory is permanent in ways that military victory never can be. These three psychological strategies, strategic vulnerability, narrative hijacking, and transforming defeat into victory, didn't just challenge the Roman Empire. They rewrote the rules of influence itself. The carpenter from Nazareth proved that the most powerful force in human civilization isn't military might or political authority. It's the ability to change how people think about reality itself. Every leader who has achieved lasting influence since then has unconsciously borrowed from his playbook. Authenticity creates connection, story creates meaning, and sacrifice creates devotion. 2,000 years later, his psychological strategies are still reshaping how power works, how influence spreads, and how ordinary people can change the world. That's not just historical significance. That's psychological immortality. If these secrets exploded your mind, you need to see my next videos. But only if you hit that bell. Otherwise, you'll miss the most powerful secrets in history. What's your opinion on the ideas presented in this content? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Send this revelation to that friend who has sharp psychological insights. This analysis is speculative and based on publicly available historical information and psychological theory, not clinical diagnosis. The interpretations presented represent one perspective on historical events and should be considered as such.